The classroom was filled with Kalrani officers when Shaw entered the next morning, and their stone-like eyes followed him as he walked to the front of the room and activated the holographic display. He had spent the night preparing this lesson, and he knew it would disturb them. But that was exactly the point. Laura Bennett stood by the door with a datapad in her hands, ready to assist with the presentation, and Marcus Cole sat in the back of the room like a shadow, watching everything with the quiet alertness of a man who had learned to never let his guard down. Shaw began without introduction, and the first image that appeared on the display was a city burning. It was an old recording from Earth, more than 300 years old, and it showed a human city reduced to rubble and ash while soldiers fought in the streets with weapons that seemed primitive by modern standards. The Kalrani watched in silence as Shaw explained what they were seeing. A conflict called World War II, a war that had killed over 70 million humans in less than a decade. And he let that number sink in before continuing. He showed them Stalingrad, where human soldiers had fought for every building and every room, where the average life expectancy of a new soldier was less than 1 day, and where neither side had been willing to retreat or surrender. The Kalrani officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one of them asked why the defenders had not evacuated when defeat was certain. Shaw answered that defeat was never certain as long as someone was willing to keep fighting. And the defenders had understood something, that their enemies did not surrender meant death, not just for them, but for everything they loved. And so they chose to die fighting instead. Bennett brought up the next set of images, recordings from the Warsaw Uprising, where civilians had taken up arms against an occupying army that outnumbered them 10-1. And they had held out for over 60 days before the end. Another officer asked what they had hoped to achieve, since the mathematical outcome was obvious from the start. And Shaw told them that hope had nothing to do with mathematics. These people had fought because fighting was the only choice that let them keep their dignity. And they had known they would die, and they had fought anyway. Vextaran was not present for this lesson, but Zephyr sat in the front row with his 4 hands clasped together, and his ancient face showed an expression that Shaw had not seen before. It looked almost like grief. Shaw continued the lesson with examples from more recent history. The colonial rebellions on Mars, where outnumbered settlers had held off Earth forces for 3 years. The asteroid mining strikes where workers had sabotaged their own equipment rather than submit to corporate control. Every example had the same pattern. And Shaw made sure the Kalrani understood what that pattern meant when humans faced destruction. They did not calculate odds or measure resources. They simply refused to stop. And that refusal made them more dangerous than any weapon or fleet. Bennett presented case studies showing how this trait had affected human military strategy, explaining that human commanders always planned for the possibility that their enemies would fight to the last soldier. Cole finally spoke up from the back of the room, and his voice was rough and low as he described his own experiences on the ground in conflicts that the Academy had probably never studied. He told them about a small colony world where 100 human farmers had faced a corporate mercenary force of over 1,000 trained soldiers. And the farmers had no military training and no advanced weapons, but they had known the land, and they had known each other, and they had refused to abandon their homes. And by the time reinforcements arrived, the farmers had lost half their number, but the mercenary force had been gutted. One of the Kalrani officers asked how that was possible, and Cole answered simply that the farmers had nothing left to lose, and that made them willing to do things that the mercenaries had never imagined. Ed Zephyr finally spoke, asking Shaw if humans enjoyed war, if this willingness to fight and die was something they celebrated. Shaw shook his head and said that humans hated war more than any species in the galaxy because they understood its true cost, and every victory was paid for in blood and grief that never fully healed. But hatred of war did not mean unwillingness to fight, he continued. And sometimes the only way to protect what you loved was to become something terrible. He paused and looked around the room at the Kelrani, officers who had probably never lost a friend in combat, who had never held a dying soldier in their arms, who had never been forced to choose between their own survival and something greater. "You came here to learn control," he said. "But control is an illusion that only exists in simulations and textbooks. Real war is chaos." He continued, "And the only thing you can control is whether you are willing to pay the price for victory. And that price is always higher than you expect." Sithmir asked what Shaw meant by price. And Shaw told him about the soldiers he had known who came home broken, about the families destroyed by loss, about the nightmares that never stopped even decades after the fighting ended. "War leaves scars that never heal," he said. "And anyone who wages war without understanding, that is not a soldier, but a murderer playing games with lives." The room was silent when he finished, and Shaw could see that his words had affected the Kelrani in ways they had not expected. One young officer asked if Shaw regretted his service, and Shaw considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said that he regretted the necessity of his service, and he regretted every life lost on both sides. But he did not regret standing between innocent people and those who would harm them. That was the difference between a warrior and a killer. He explained, and a warrior fights because someone must, while a killer fights because they enjoy it. Sithmir rose from his seat and addressed the room, telling the other officers that they had learned more in this single morning than in years of simulation training. He turned to Shaw and asked what the next lesson would be, and Shaw answered that words could only teach so much sooner or later. He said, "You will have to see the truth for yourselves, and I hope you are ready for what that means." The words hung in the air like a warning, and no one in the room knew that the opportunity for a practical demonstration was already approaching, carried on the wings of a crisis that would test everything they had learned. Cole caught Shaw's eye as the officers filed out, and the Marine's expression said that he felt it too. The instinct every veteran developed, the sense that violence was coming. They had come here to teach, but Shaw suspected that the real lessons were still ahead. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, transmitted across 17 relay stations and 400 light-years of empty space, and Commander Daniel Shaw read it 3 times before he believed what it said. The Kelrani Dominion, rulers of 12 star systems and commanders of the largest fleet in the known galaxy, had sent a formal request to Earth, and they wanted something that no one had ever asked for before. They wanted to learn about war. Shaw sat in his small office at Earth Defense Command and stared at the holographic text floating above his desk, wondering if this was some kind of joke or test. But the authentication codes were genuine and the diplomatic seals were verified. The Kelrani wanted a human instructor, and somehow his name had ended up on the short list. He was 53 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes, and he had fought in 3 colonial wars that had cost him friends, sleep, and any illusion that violence was glorious. And now an alien empire wanted him to teach them how to do what he had spent decades trying to forget. Admiral Catherine Ross called him into her office an hour later, and she explained the situation with her usual bluntness. The Kelrani had dominated their region of space for over 1,000 years, she said, and they had won every war through superior numbers, advanced technology, and precise mathematical calculations. But something had changed in recent decades. Smaller species had begun resisting them in ways they could not predict or counter, and rebellions that should have been crushed in days stretched into months and years. And the Kelrani could not understand why. They had analyzed human military history and noticed a pattern. Ross continued, and humans had a way of fighting that defied their models and broke their simulations. And they believed that humans possessed some secret knowledge about warfare that they lacked. Shaw almost laughed at that, because the only secret humans possessed was a willingness to suffer and die that most sensible species found incomprehensible. But he kept his mouth shut and listened. The assignment would take him to Helix Prime, a neutral station at the edge of Kelrani space, where he would serve as Earth's representative at the Galactic Military Academy. And he would have a small staff of human officers to assist him. Ross made it clear that this was not a request, and Earth needed allies in a galaxy full of potential threats. And if the Kelrani wanted to learn from humans, then humans would teach them. Shaw accepted the assignment because he had no choice. And 2 weeks later, he boarded a transport ship and began the long journey to Helix Prime. The station was massive, a spinning wheel of metal and glass that housed over 50,000 beings from a dozen different species. And Shaw felt small and out of place as he walked through corridors designed for creatures twice his size. His quarters were comfortable but sterile, and his staff consisted of 2 officers who seemed as confused about their mission as he was. Lieutenant Laura Bennett was young and eager, a tactical specialist who had graduated at the top of her class and never seen actual combat. And she reminded Shaw of himself 30 years ago, before the wars had taught him what the Academy never could. Captain Marcus Cole was the opposite, a Marine officer with scars on his face and shadows in his eyes. And he had fought on the ground in conflicts that the news feeds preferred to ignore. And Shaw recognized a kindred spirit the moment they shook hands. Their first meeting with the Kelrani took place in a conference room that felt more like a cathedral, with high ceilings and walls covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift when Shaw was not looking directly at them. Admiral Vex Torn was waiting for them, a tall figure with blue-gray skin and 4 arms folded across his chest. And his eyes were like polished stones that reflected light but revealed nothing. High Scholar Zethmir stood beside him, shorter and older, with a face marked by lines that might have been age or wisdom or both. And he greeted the humans with a gesture that Bennett had told Shaw was a sign of respect. Vex Torn wasted no time on pleasantries and asked why the humans had sent a single commander instead of a full delegation. And his voice carried a tone that suggested he already considered this mission a waste of time. Shaw answered calmly that 1 teacher was enough, if the students were willing to learn. And he saw something flicker in Zethmir's eyes that might have been amusement. The Kelrani explained what they wanted, and Vex Torn spoke of control, discipline, and efficiency, of wars won through calculation and resources managed with precision. And he made it sound like warfare was nothing more than a complex equation waiting to be solved. Shaw listened without interrupting. And when Vex Torn finished, he asked a simple question: what happens when your enemy refuses to follow your calculations? Vex Torn dismissed the question as irrelevant, arguing that any rational enemy would surrender when faced with certain defeat, and continuing to fight against impossible odds was simply illogical. Shaw nodded slowly and asked if he could observe their training simulations before beginning his instruction. And Zethmir agreed immediately, overriding whatever objection Vex Torn was about to make. The simulation chamber was a technological marvel, capable of recreating any battle scenario with perfect accuracy. And Shaw watched as Kelrani officers commanded virtual fleets against various enemies. They won every engagement with mathematical precision, calculating optimal firing solutions and acceptable casualty ratios. And their victories were clean and efficient and utterly predictable. Then Shaw asked them to run a different scenario, one where the enemy had already lost by every measurable standard, where surrender was the only logical option, where continued resistance meant total annihilation. The Kelrani programmed the simulation and launched their attack, expecting a quick surrender, but the simulated enemy fought anyway. They fought with desperation and fury, ramming ships into Kelrani formations and sacrificing themselves to destroy vital targets. And they inflicted casualties that the Kelrani had not predicted because their models assumed rationality when the simulation ended. Vex Torn declared it a meaningless anomaly. But Zethmir stared at the casualty figures with something like fear in his ancient eyes. Shaw stood up and faced them both, and he told them that he would teach them what they asked. But he warned them that they might not like what they learned at war could not be controlled. He said, and it could not be calculated or predicted or contained. And anyone who believed otherwise had never truly fought one. The Kelrani had conquered 12 star systems, without ever facing an enemy willing to die rather than surrender. And that was not strength, that was luck. And luck always ran out eventually. Zither asked what humans knew that the Kelrani did not. And Shaw answered with a single word: loss. He turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving the Kelrani to consider what that word really meant. And behind him, Laura Bennett and Marcus Cole exchanged a glance that said they understood exactly what was coming. The lesson had begun. The alarms woke Shaw from a dreamless sleep, and he was on his feet and reaching for his uniform before his mind fully processed what was happening. Red lights flashed in the corridor as he ran toward the command center, and the station's artificial gravity flickered for a moment before stabilizing, which told him that something had hit Helix Prime hard enough to stress its systems. Laura Bennett met him at the entrance to the command center, and her face was pale, but her voice was steady as she briefed him on the situation. A species called the Vrethkai had launched a surprise attack on a neutral colony world called New Haven, located less than 2 light years from Helix Prime. And initial reports indicated that they had landed ground forces and were actively threatening civilian populations. Shaw had heard of the Vrethkai, but had never encountered them, and Bennett filled in the gaps as they walked. They were a predator species that had been confined to a single system by treaty for the past century, and something had changed, either their leadership or their desperation. And now they were expanding by force. Admiral Vex Torn was already in the command center when Shaw arrived, and the Kelrani was coordinating his fleet with the cold efficiency that Shaw had come to expect. Plan was straightforward and mathematically sound. A pincer movement that would trap the Vrethkai ships between 2 Kelrani battle groups and destroy them with minimal friendly losses. Shaw studied the tactical display and saw the flaw immediately. And he asked about the civilians on New Haven. Vex Torn answered that the civilian population was a secondary concern, and the primary objective was the destruction of the Vrethkai fleet. And once that was accomplished, ground forces could be deployed to secure any survivors. Shaw felt something cold settle in his chest, and he asked how long the fleet engagement would take. Vex Torn estimated 4 to 6 hours for complete victory. And Shaw calculated in his head how many civilians would die in that time. While the Kelrani focused on their optimal strategy, he turned to Zethmir, who had entered the command center quietly and was watching the exchange with troubled eyes. And Shaw requested permission to lead a small human team in a parallel ground operation. Vex Torn dismissed the idea as irrelevant and inefficient, arguing that a handful of humans could not affect the outcome of a planetary assault, and any resources diverted from the main engagement would reduce overall efficiency. But Zethmir raised one of his 4 hands and silenced the admiral, and he looked at Shaw for a long moment before asking what the commander had in mind. Shaw explained that Marcus Cole and a team of Marines could reach New Haven ahead of the fleet engagement, and while they could not defeat the Vrethkai forces, they could protect civilians and gather intelligence that might prove valuable. It was not optimal by Kelrani standards, he admitted, but it was necessary by human standards. Ethelmer authorized the mission over Vex Tor's objections, and Shaw felt a grim satisfaction as he left the command center to find Cole. The Marine was already preparing his team when Shaw reached the hangar, and Cole's face showed no surprise when Shaw told him what they were about to do. 12 Marines in light armor with standard weapons against an unknown number of Vrethkai soldiers, with no orbital support and no extraction plan. And Cole simply nodded and told his people to load up. Bennett wanted to come, But Shaw ordered her to remain on the station and coordinate communications. And she argued until he reminded her that someone had to tell their story if they did not come back. The transport ship was fast but lightly armed, designed for speed rather than combat, and Cole spent the journey checking his weapon and reviewing what little intelligence they had on the HFY were larger than humans, with thick hides and claws designed for ripping flesh. And they fought with a brutal directness that left little room for subtlety. Shaw watched his Marines prepare for battle and saw no fear in their eyes, only the focused calm of professionals who had accepted their mortality. Long ago, New Haven appeared on the view screen as they approached, a green and blue world that looked peaceful from orbit. But the smoke rising from the main settlement told a different story. They landed 2 kilometers from the colony and moved on foot through dense forest. And Cole took point with the instinct of a man who had done this 100 times before. First HFY patrol they encountered never saw them coming, and Cole's Marines eliminated them with silent efficiency, using blades instead of energy weapons to avoid alerting others. Shaw was not a ground combat specialist, but he had seen enough fighting to recognize skill when he witnessed it. And Cole's team moved like ghosts through the alien forest. They reached the colony's outer perimeter and found the situation worse than expected, with HFY soldiers herding civilians toward a central plaza. And Shaw's stomach turned when he realized why the HFY were taking hostages, either for leverage or for darker purposes. And there was no time to wait for the fleet engagement to conclude. Cole looked at Shaw and asked for orders. And Shaw knew that any attack would cost lives, but waiting would cost more. He gave the order, and Cole's Marines moved. The next 20 minutes were a blur of violence and noise, with energy weapons flashing and bodies falling and screams echoing through the burning streets. Shaw found himself fighting beside Cole, using a weapon he had not fired in years, and the old reflexes came back like they had never left. The HFY were larger and stronger, but they fought like predators expecting easy prey, and they were not prepared for humans who refused to retreat. Cole lost 3 Marines in the first assault, but they broke through to the plaza and formed a defensive perimeter around the civilians. The HFY regrouped and attacked again, and Shaw watched a young Marine named Danny Rivera take a claw strike meant for a child before putting a shot through the attacker's skull. Rivera died with the child still clutching his hand, and Shaw felt something break inside him, the same thing that had broken in every war he had ever fought. But they held, and the HFY fell back. And when the Kelrani fleet finally achieved orbital superiority 3 hours later, every hostage was still alive. Vivis Turin's voice came through the communication channel, announcing complete victory over the HFY fleet and congratulating the human team on their survival. Shaw looked at the bodies of his fallen Marines, at the blood staining the plaza stones, at the civilians weeping with relief and grief, and he wondered what the Admiral thought victory meant. Cole stood beside him, wounded but alive, and the Marines said nothing because there was nothing to say. The mission was complete. The hostages were saved, and the cost had been paid in the only currency that war accepted later. When the Kelrani officers asked how they had achieved what the calculations said was impossible, Shaw would tell them the truth. They had not tried to control the battle, he would say, and they had simply refused to lose. And sometimes that was enough. But standing in that plaza, surrounded by the dead and the saved, Shaw felt no triumph. He felt only the weight of 4 more names that would haunt his sleep forever. The HFY response came 3 days later, and it came with a fury that caught everyone by surprise. Shaw was in the medical bay visiting his wounded Marines when the first explosion shook Helix Prime, and the station lurched hard enough to throw him against the wall before the stabilizers compensated. Bennett's voice came through his communicator, tight with controlled panic, and she reported that a HFY battle fleet had dropped out of hyperspace less than 50,000 kilometers from the station. They had come for revenge. and they had brought enough ships to reduce Helix Prime to rubble. Shaw reached the command center as the second wave of missiles struck the station's outer shields, and the holographic display showed a nightmare scenario unfolding in real. TMI-37 HFY warships were advancing in attack formation, and the station's defenses were not designed to handle an assault of this magnitude. Devatorn was already calculating withdrawal options, and his voice remained calm as he explained that the optimal strategy was to evacuate essential personnel and retreat to the nearest Kalrani stronghold. Shaw listened to the admiral's words and felt cold rage building in his chest. Because Helix Prime was not just a military installation, 50,000 beings lived on this station, including families and children and civilians who had nothing to do with the war that had just arrived at their doorstep. He asked Vextorn about the evacuation capacity, and the admiral answered that approximately 8,000 could be transported on available vessels. That meant 42,000 would be left behind to die. Shaw turned to Zethmir and asked if the High Scholar agreed with this plan. And Zethmir's ancient face showed more conflict than Shaw had ever seen. The mathematics were clear, the admiral said, and sacrificing 42,000 to save 8,000 and preserve the fleet was the logical choice. Shaw walked to the center of the command room and faced the Kalrani officers who had spent weeks learning about human warfare, and he asked them if they remembered the lessons. Vexterin demanded to know what lessons could possibly matter when the calculations were so obvious, and Shaw answered with a question of his own. He asked what made the 8,000 worth saving and the 42,000 worth abandoning, and when the admiral could not answer, Shaw told him nothing. He said, because every life mattered equally, and any strategy that treated people as acceptable losses was not strategy, but cowardice. Ezra rose from his seat and stood beside Shaw, and for the first time since they had met, the High Scholar openly defied his admiral. Kalrani would stand and fight, Zethmir declared, and they would stand with the humans who had shown them what courage meant. Vexterin argued, but other officers in the room sided with Zethmir, and the admiral found himself overruled by his own people. Shaw did not waste time on gratitude, because they had a battle to plan and very little time to do. I worked with Bennett and the Kalrani tactical officers to develop a defense that would use every advantage they had, and the plan was risky and desperate and nothing like what the Academy had taught. Laura Bennett volunteered to lead a fighter squadron in defense of the civilian sectors, and Shaw tried to refuse, but she reminded him that this was exactly the kind of fight she had trained for. Cole was still recovering from his wounds, but the Marine forced himself out of the medical bay and gathered every human soldier on the station who could hold a weapon. They would form a boarding defense if the HFY breached the station's hull. And Cole's eyes held the same quiet determination that Shaw had seen on New Haven. The battle began with fire and thunder, with Kalrani ships engaging the HFY fleet while the station's weapons added their own fury to the chaos. Shaw watched the tactical display and made decisions that he knew would cost lives, directing ships into positions that would maximize damage to the enemy, even at terrible cost to themselves. Bennett's fighter wing dove into the heart of the HFY formation, and Shaw heard her voice over the communication channel, calm and professional, as she called out targets and coordinated attacks. 2 of her fighters died in the first pass, but they took 4 HFY bombers with them, and those bombers would never reach the civilian sectors. The Kalrani fought with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including themselves, and Vextorin commanded from his flagship with cold precision that gradually transformed into something fiercer. A Kalrani cruiser named the Eternal Purpose rammed a HFY battleship at full speed, and the captain's final words were transmitted across all channels, a declaration that the purpose of the Kalrani was to protect the innocent. Shaw felt tears on his face, and he did not wipe them away. The HFY broke through the outer defense line, and launched boarding pods at the station. And Cole's Marines met them in the corridors. With weapons blazing, Shaw grabbed a rifle and joined the defense. Because there was no point in surviving if his people died while he watched from safety. The fighting was brutal and close, with Rethkai claws tearing through armor and human weapons burning through alien flesh. And Shaw lost count of how many enemies he killed. He found Cole defending a junction that led to the residential sectors, and the Marine was bleeding from a dozen wounds, but still standing. Still fighting. They held that junction together as wave after wave of Rethkai tried to break through. And Shaw felt something he had not felt in years. A fierce pride in what humans could be when they chose to stand. The battle turned when the Kalrani flagship broke through the Rethkai center and destroyed their command vessel. And without coordination, the enemy attack began to falter. Bennett's fighters hunted down the remaining bombers while the station's weapons hammered the retreating ships. And one by one, the Rethkai died or fled when the last enemy ship jumped to hyperspace. Shaw stood in the corridor surrounded by bodies and debris. And he looked at Marcus Cole and saw that the Marine was smiling. They had won. But the cost was almost beyond counting. A third of the human contingent was dead or wounded. And the Kalrani had lost more ships in a single day than they had lost in a century. Cole collapsed against the wall. And Shaw caught him before he hit the ground. But the Marine's eyes were already empty. He had held on just long enough to see the battle end. And then he had finally allowed himself to rest. Shaw held his friend's body and wept. And around him the station groaned and sparked as damage control teams fought to keep it alive. Vestorin found him there an hour later. And the Admiral stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. He asked if Shaw considered this a victory. And Shaw looked at the station that was still standing, at the civilians who were still breathing, at the cost that had been paid to make that possible. Yes, he answered. And the word tasted like ash in his mouth. Vestorin nodded slowly. And something had changed in the Admiral's stone-like eyes. Something that looked almost human. Then I begin to understand, the Kalrani said, and walked away to count his own dead. The memorial service was held in the largest hall on Helix Prime, a vast chamber that had been designed for diplomatic gatherings and now served a far different purpose. Rows of photographs lined the walls, human faces beside Kalrani faces, soldiers who had fallen together in defense of a station that had never been their home. Shaw stood at the front of the hall and looked out at the crowd, seeing humans and Kalrani sitting side by side in a way that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. Laura Bennett sat in the front row with her arm in a sling, her face marked by burns from a cockpit fire that had nearly killed her. And she watched Shaw with eyes that held grief and something else, something that looked like understanding. The empty seat beside her was where Marcus Cole would have sat. And Shaw felt the weight of that absence like a stone on his chest. He had given many speeches in his life, to troops before battle and to politicians who did not understand what they were asking. But this one was harder than any of them. Zethmer had asked him to speak, to give voice to what the humans had taught and what the Kalrani had learned. And Shaw had agreed, because Cole deserved that much. He began by speaking the names of the fallen, every human Marine and every Kalrani soldier. And the list took nearly 10 minutes to complete. When he finished, the silence in the hall was absolute. And Shaw let it stretch before continuing. He told him that he had come to Helix Prime expecting to teach lessons that the Kalrani would never truly understand, because he had believed that war was something humans knew and others could only study from a distance. Admitted that he had been wrong. The Kalrani who had died defending this station had understood war as completely as any human ever had, and they had paid the same price that humans had been paying for thousands of years. War was not about species or culture or military tradition. Shaw continued, and it was about choices made in moments of crisis, about the willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than survival. The Kelrani had made those choices, and they had become warriors in the truest sense of the word. Vex Turan sat near the back of the hall, and Shaw noticed that the Admiral's stone-like face had changed, softened by something that might have been grief or respect or both. The Admiral had lost friends in the battle. Shaw knew commanders he had served with for decades, and for the first time, Vextorn understood why humans hated war so deeply. Zithimer rose from his seat and walked to stand beside Shaw, and the High Scholar addressed the assembly in his own language before switching to standard so the humans could understand. He said that the Kelrani had sent a request to Earth seeking to learn control, believing that humans possessed some secret technique for managing warfare, but the humans had taught them something far more valuable. Zethmir continued, and they had taught the Kelrani why war must always be the last resort. The cost of victory was never measured in ships or resources, the High Scholar said, and it was measured in lives ended and futures destroyed. In grief that would echo through generations. Any species that waged war without understanding the cost was not civilized but savage, and the Kelrani had come dangerously close to forgetting that true. Shaw felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Vex Torn standing beside him, and the Admiral's expression held no trace of the cold arrogance Shaw had seen in their first meeting. The Admiral spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, and he apologized for dismissing human warfare as primitive and emotional. He had believed that efficiency was the highest virtue in combat, Vextorn said, and he had been taught that acceptable losses were the foundation of strategy. But watching humans die to save civilians who meant nothing to them, watching Kelrani officers sacrifice themselves to protect strangers, the Admiral had finally understood what he had been missing. War was not about calculation, Vextorn continued, and it was about purpose, about fighting for something that mattered more than victory itself. He offered Shaw a formal military alliance between the Kelrani Dominion and Earth, not as teachers and students, but as equals who had earned each other's respect through blood and sacrifice. Shaw accepted the offer with a simple nod, because words seemed inadequate to the moment. Bennett rose from her seat and made her way to the front of the hall, and she asked Shaw to say the words that humans had spoken over their fallen for as long as anyone could. Remember, he closed his eyes and spoke the ancient phrases, the promise to remember and the vow to honor. And when he opened his eyes, he saw that many of the Kelrani were weeping. Their species expressed grief differently, with patterns forming on their skin and their four hands clasped together. But the emotion was the same. The service ended with a moment of silence that stretched into minutes, and slowly the hall began to empty as humans and Kelrani filed out together. Zither remained behind, and he approached Shaw with a small device in his hands. It was a Kelrani memory crystal, the High Scholar explained, capable of storing information for thousands of years. And Zethmir had been recording Shaw's words since the first day of his instruction, told Shaw that the recording would be placed in the Kelrani archives, accessible to every future generation, so that they would never forget what they had learned on Helix Prime. Shaw asked what the recording would be called, and Zethmir answered without hesitation the human lesson. He said, and it would teach the Kelrani not how to wage war, but why they must do everything in their power to avoid it. Shaw thanked the High Scholar and turned to leave, but Zethmir called after him with one final question. He asked if Shaw believed that peace was truly possible, if species that had evolved for conflict could ever learn to live without it. Shaw considered the question for a long time. Before answering, he said that he did not know if permanent peace was possible, but he believed that every moment of peace was worth fighting for, and every war avoided was a victory greater than any battle won. The lesson was never about control, Shaw continued, and it was about understanding that war destroys everything it touches. Even the winners. We fight because we must, he said, but we must never fight because we want to. And the day we forget That is the day we stop being He-Man. Zethman nodded slowly and recorded Shaw's final words into the crystal. And the High Scholar's ancient eyes held something that looked almost like hope. Shaw walked out of the memorial hall and found Bennett waiting for him. And they stood together in silence, looking out the observation window at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Vrethkai were licking their wounds and wondering what had happened. How a station that should have fallen had instead become a graveyard for their fleet. Other species would hear the story. Shaw knew, and they would learn that humans and Kalrani had stood together against impossible odds. And they would think twice before testing that alliance, but that was a concern for another day for now. Shaw thought only of the fallen, of Cole and Rivera and all the others who had given everything so that strangers could live. He thought of the lessons taught and the lessons learned, and he hoped that somewhere, in whatever came after death, his fallen soldiers knew that their sacrifice had meant something. The stars burned cold and distant, indifferent to the struggles of the beings who lived beneath them. But Shaw looked at them anyway and made a silent promise he would remember, and he would teach others to remember. Until the day came when no one needed to learn what war really meant. That was the only victory that truly mattered, and it was a victory worth any cost.